Hello and welcome to Williams Mullins Trending Now, an IP podcast, a legal podcast focused on providing innovative companies and investors with important and timely information concerning intangible assets such as patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets. I'm your host, Courtney Regal, and today I'll be joined by my colleague, Ed White, a partner in our IP practice group here at the firm, to discuss an important and fun topic, social media. How are you doing today, Ed?
I'm good, Courtney. How are you?
I'm doing well. And like I said, this is a fun topic and I'm looking forward to discussing it today. Why don't you go ahead and start us off by explaining how brands can really utilize social media to expand their presence?
Yeah, absolutely. It really is a great frontier to build and expand brand equity by using social media. So we're going to talk about a few things today. We're going to talk about how companies can use social media to really create brand identifiers and even personalities for their brands among their consumers and fans. So let's just start out with the question, well, how do you protect your intellectual property when you're using it on social media? Well, obviously, registrations can be important. I think a lot of our listeners probably know that in the United States, under U.S. trademark law, your rights in a mark come from your use of the mark in commerce and your continued use of the mark in commerce. But a registration for a trademark is a very valuable and strong enforcement tool to have. So if at all possible, our listeners will want to register their trademarks before they use them on social media. And then once they begin using the marks on social media, they want to ensure that their trademarks are used properly and consistently so that they can build and maintain their brand equity. And that includes when they utilize influencers on social media, which we're going to talk a bit more about in a few minutes. For example, when you're using a trademark in social media, you want to ensure that you're not using your trademark in a generic manner. You never want to use the trademark as a noun, for example, where you may somehow dilute the value of the mark as a trademark and instead endanger the mark from genericide. You also want to make sure that you're using the proper marking. So oftentimes our listeners probably see adjacent to trademarks a superscript SM or TM. When they see that, that's indicating to the public that the trademark owner asserts common law trademark rights in the trademark. Whereas when they see the circle R symbol, the owner is asserting that they have a registration, which, again, because of the value of the registration as an enforcement tool, it can be a deterrent to infringement by third parties. And then finally, they want to make sure that they're properly monitoring their trademarks when they use them in social media. It's incumbent on any intellectual property owner to police their intellectual property rights to ensure that third parties aren't infringing those rights. And an increasing number of brands who utilize their marks in social media now use artificial intelligence as well as other programs to ensure that copyrights, trademarks, et cetera, are not being infringed by third parties. So that's something important to utilize and implement when you're using your trademarks and other intellectual property in social media.
Thanks, Ed. And what do you recommend in the event a company does discover infringement of its intellectual property, including on social media?
Yeah, that's a great question with regard to social media, because obviously social media can be a real boon to your brand, but you also have to be very, very careful. I think we all know by using social media ourselves as consumers that social media amplifies everything. So it's going to amplify the good, it's going to amplify the bad, it's going to amplify the ugly. And so you really do need to be considerate and deliberate in the way you enforce your rights when it comes to infringers on social media. In essence, you really want to, if possible, take a light hand when you go about that enforcement. And I've actually got a really, I think, neat example of that. I know, Courtney, you and I have talked about Stranger Things, the show on Netflix. We're both fans. I know my kids got me a couple of years binge watching it, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners watch it as well. And, back in 2017, there were some fans of the show in Chicago who decided that they would set up a pop-up bar with the theme of the Stranger Things show. And they actually called I'm not going to give any spoilers here, but they actually called the bar the Upside Down, which anybody who watches the show knows that you don't necessarily want to end up in the Upside Down. But what they did, which I thought was very creative, was they sent a cease and desist letter, a demand letter, to the Chicago bar. But they did it in a way where they ingratiated themselves to the bar owners and to their fans. And let me just read a couple lines from the letter, because I think it's pretty funny. They wrote, "My walkie-talkie is busted." That's how the letter began. So I had to write this note instead. I heard you launched a Stranger Things pop-up bar at your Logan Square location. Look, I don't want you to think I'm a total wasteoid, and I love how much you guys love the show. Just wait until you see season 2. But unless I'm living in the upside down, I don't think we did a deal with you to use our mark. And it went on from there. And so, inevitably, the letter was posted by the owners of the pop-up bar. It actually was a win-win. It gave them free press and helped them expand their numbers during the 6-week run that they had. But at the end of the 6-week run, it was a win for Netflix because they took the pop-up bar down. And Netflix showed to their fans that that it's all in good fun and they appreciate their fans. So that's just an example of a great way to go about trying to enforce your rights in social media in a temperate way that will be a win-win for your brand.
I would say I think that segues pretty well into another topic that we were wanting to discuss today, which is just because how visible your social media presence is, it's really important to be having a company-wide policy or some type of guidance for your employees, especially when they're using a company social media account, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, any of that. And a couple important things to think about including in these policies. One is how your employees should be using your own brand. So trademarks, copyrights, using those markings that you discussed, Ed, to show that the marks are always registered if they are or are being claimed as trademarks. Another thing that companies should consider including in these policies is sourcing third-party materials. It's very easy to repost materials on social media without checking what the source was. And we don't want people to be using intellectual property without proper licenses or other permissions. So that's something that a company-wide policy can also address. Another thing that we've seen on social media is an employee may inadvertently disclose proprietary information, such as a new product launch or an upcoming collaboration that hasn't been announced yet. And that information is very valuable, and releasing that in advance can obviously do some damage. So really thinking through as a whole how you want your social media branding to be presented to the public, and kind of putting some guidelines in place for employees is incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. And likewise, to segue on that, in addition to making sure that you've got a unified strategy with regard to social media and how your employees use it, obviously, it's now very important to make sure that you're doing the same, bulwark with your influencers. A lot of companies are using influencers now, not surprisingly, to expand their brands. But when you deal with influencers, you need to ensure that you're taking into account a few things. Number one, you want to make sure that you've got a detailed outline on the scope of work. What do you expect from these influencers? What type of content should they post? Will they post? Where will they post it and publish it? How frequently should they post or publish content? That should be part of your agreement with them. You also want to make sure that they're aware of your branding requirements. In the same way, Courtney, as you just said, that you have your employees aware of it, you want to make sure that the influencers are out there using your trademarks and other intellectual property, properly and in a way that's going to expand your equity. You also need to make sure that that both you and the influencer are aware of the FTC guidelines. For example, if they're going to tout a product, they need to ensure that they're mentioning in that advertising that it's sponsored, because otherwise you may run afoul of the FTC guidelines. And you want to make sure that both you and the influencer own the content that they're posting. Obviously, you never want to run afoul or step on the toes of a third party and infringe their intellectual property. And so you want to make sure that from the outset, everybody's aware of that and they're sensitive to that. To the extent that there's confidentiality that needs to be included. Obviously, if you're working with an influencer, in the same vein, Courtney, that you were just talking about employees, well, that influencer is probably going to know some confidential information about your products, your strategies, when you'll launch, et cetera. Well, you need to make sure, obviously, that's being kept confidential and they understand that. And then finally, with any good deal, and certainly with an influencer, you want to make sure that you have a proper termination clause, something that you can utilize if and when you need to terminate your relationship with the influencer. Certainly if the influencer should do something that's unreasonable or harm the reputation of the company. And on that front, Courtney, one thing that I know you and I have been seeing a lot about in the news since last summer is the name and likeness laws that are coming out, specifically with NCAA athletes. And since these athletes can now really stand in the place of influencers, can you tell our audience a little bit about your thoughts on that front?
Yeah, sure, Ed. As you mentioned, this is kind of a new category, I guess, of influencers because college athletes previously, before the NCAA changed its rules, were not able to essentially capitalize on their own name, image, and likeness. As you mentioned, even though those NCAA rules have changed, there are other things that companies and influencers that are student athletes should be considering when they're entering into these deals. States are coming out with different laws governing use of name, image, and likeness for college students and athletes. And there are also universities and colleges that have their own internal policies that may restrict certain types of endorsement deals or otherwise put guidelines in place for what these student athletes can and cannot do. So for companies that are entering into agreements with these student athletes, it's definitely something to be aware of. And as you mentioned, I definitely see that becoming more and more prevalent and everyone hearing more about those name, image, and likeness deals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something we may want to bring up on a future podcast to just ensure that people aren't running afoul of the state laws, the NCAA rules, and even university rules, because they certainly don't want to put the athlete or the entity in a bind. Thank you so much for that, Courtney. That'll wrap up our discussion on utilizing social media to generate intellectual property value. I'd like to thank Courtney for joining me on Trending Now, an IP podcast. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please contact us. You can also visit our intellectual property practice page at williamsmullen.com/IP. There you can find out more about our team, as well as our past episodes of this podcast and legal alerts. And be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when our next episode posts. Thanks for listening. And until next time, this is Courtney and Ed.